Charles Vane emerged from the shadows of history sometime around 1680, born into an England that was transforming itself with bewildering speed. Unlike his more famous contemporary Edward Teach, who would become known as Blackbeard, Vane's origins remain largely mysterious, swallowed by the indifference that time shows to the early lives of men who would later challenge the established order of the world. What little we know of his beginnings suggests he was born somewhere in England, possibly in one of the port cities that were growing fat on the wealth flowing back from the American colonies. The England of Vane's youth was a nation drunk on its own possibilities, intoxicated by the riches arriving from Virginia's tobacco plantations, Jamaica's sugar estates, and the exotic spice markets of the East Indies. London's population was exploding, doubling and then tripling as people flowed in from the countryside, drawn by stories of opportunity that seemed to promise any man might remake himself if he possessed sufficient courage and cunning. But for every merchant prince who found fortune in this new world, 10 others discovered only disappointment and degradation. The same forces that created unprecedented wealth also generated unprecedented misery, as traditional ways of life were destroyed by economic changes that few understood and fewer still could control. Villages that had existed for centuries were abandoned as their inhabitants fled to the cities, leaving behind empty houses that would slowly crumble back into the earth that had birthed them. Vane's family, whatever their specific circumstances, was almost certainly among those caught in this great transformation. They occupied that precarious middle ground between prosperity and poverty that characterized so many English households in this era of rapid change, neither wealthy enough to benefit significantly from the new opportunities, nor poor enough to qualify for the grudging charity that English society provided for its most desperate members. The boy who would become one of history's most uncompromising pirates grew up watching the harsh machinery of early capitalism operate around him. He would have seen how quickly fortunes could change, how arbitrary the distribution of prosperity seemed to be, how little connection there was between a man's worth and his worldly success. These observations planted seeds of skepticism about the justice of the established order that would eventually bloom into the fierce independence that characterized his adult career. Unlike many of his contemporaries who drifted into piracy through desperation or circumstance, Vane appears to have been drawn to the sea by something deeper than mere economic necessity. The maritime world of late 17th century England offered one of the few remaining avenues for genuine social mobility, a place where competence and courage could matter more than birth and breeding. For a young man with intelligence and ambition, but no family connections, the sea represented possibility in its purest form. The path that led Charles Vane from the obscurity of his English origins to the Caribbean waters where he would make his reputation was almost certainly through the complex world of privateering that flourished during the constant warfare of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Privateering occupied a unique position in the legal and moral framework of the age, simultaneously legitimate and criminal depending on circumstances that were often impossible to determine with certainty. A privateer operating under proper commission was a legal combatant serving his country's interests, entitled to capture enemy vessels and claim a share of their value as prize money. The same ship operating without commission or beyond the terms of its authorization was engaged in piracy and subject to the death penalty if captured. This ambiguity appealed to men like Vane, offering them the opportunity to engage in what was essentially licensed robbery while maintaining the fiction of patriotic service. The Caribbean in Vane's era was the epicenter of this maritime warfare, a vast archipelago where English, Spanish, French, and Dutch colonies existed in uneasy proximity, their boundaries constantly shifting with the fortunes of European politics. The complex geography of islands and channels provided perfect cover for the hit-and-run tactics that privateering required, while the enormous wealth generated by sugar plantations and silver mines made the region irresistibly attractive to men willing to risk their lives for a share of the profits. Vane's early career as a privateer would have provided him with the comprehensive education in seamanship, navigation, and maritime warfare that would later make him one of the most formidable pirates of his generation. He would have learned to read wind and weather, to handle the complex rigging that controlled a ship's movements, to navigate by the stars across thousands of miles of open ocean. More importantly, he would have absorbed the tactical knowledge necessary for successful maritime predation, how to approach a target without arousing suspicion, how to use superior speed and firepower to force surrender without costly fighting, how to transfer cargo efficiently while maintaining control of potentially dangerous prisoners. But Vane also learned more subtle lessons about the psychology of maritime warfare, understanding how reputation could be more valuable than actual strength, how the threat of violence could often achieve more than violence itself. He observed how successful captains cultivated their images, creating personas that would intimidate enemies and inspire loyalty among their own men. These observations would prove crucial to his later success as a pirate captain, when psychological warfare became one of his most effective weapons. The democratic traditions of privateering would have appealed strongly to Vane's nature, offering him his first taste of the kind of life he truly wanted to lead. Aboard a privateer, a man's worth was determined by his competence and courage rather than his birth or connections. Decisions were often made collectively, with the crew having a voice in the selection of targets and the distribution of profits. Most importantly, the arbitrary authority that characterized life ashore was replaced by a system based on mutual dependence and shared risk. As Vane's experience and reputation grew, so did his understanding of the broader political and economic forces that shaped the maritime world. The Caribbean was not simply a collection of tropical islands, but the center of a global system of trade and exploitation that generated enormous wealth for European merchants and investors, while subjecting millions of Africans to the horrors of slavery. The sugar that sweetened European tea was produced by human beings who had been torn from their homeland and condemned to lives of brutal labor on plantations that were essentially factories for the production of agricultural commodities. This system was maintained through a combination of legal authority and organized violence that extended across oceans and continents. Naval vessels patrolled shipping lanes to protect merchant vessels and suppress piracy. Colonial governments enacted laws that favored plantation owners and merchants, while denying basic rights to slaves, indentured servants, and other exploited populations. European courts provided legal frameworks that transformed human suffering into legally sanctioned profit. Vane's growing awareness of these realities would have contributed to his eventual break with legitimate authority and his embrace of piracy as an alternative way of life. Unlike many of his contemporaries who viewed piracy simply as a criminal enterprise, Vane appears to have understood it as a form of rebellion against a system that he had come to see as fundamentally unjust. The transformation from privateer to pirate was not a sudden conversion, but a gradual evolution that reflected Vane's growing understanding of his own nature and desires. He had found in the maritime world a kind of life that suited his temperament perfectly, but he had also discovered that he was unwilling to subordinate his own interests to those of authorities he neither respected nor trusted. The opportunity to make this transition came during one of the periodic breaks in official warfare that provided legal cover for privateering activities. When peace treaties temporarily ended conflicts between European powers, thousands of experienced maritime warriors found themselves without legitimate employment, their skills suddenly transformed from patriotic assets into criminal liabilities. Many former privateers accepted this change and sought legitimate employment as merchant sailors or naval officers. Others retired on their accumulated prize money and attempted to establish themselves as respectable members of colonial society. But a significant number, including Vane, chose to continue their maritime careers outside the bounds of legal authority, becoming pirates in the true sense of the word. Vane's decision to embrace piracy wasn't made lightly or impulsively. He understood that he was choosing a path that would make him an outlaw, cutting him off forever from the possibility of a conventional life. But he also understood that conventional life had never offered him the opportunities or satisfactions that he had found at sea. Piracy represented not a rejection of society so much as the creation of an alternative society based on different principles and values. The pirate community that Vane joined was far more complex and sophisticated than the simple criminal organization that popular imagination would later create. It was, in its own rough way, a democratic society that offered its members freedoms and opportunities that were unavailable in the conventional world. Pirates elected their own officers, made collective decisions about targets and tactics, and shared their profits according to agreed-upon formulas that were often more equitable than the payment systems used by legitimate employers. More importantly, the pirate community provided Vane with something he had been seeking throughout his life, a place where his particular combination of intelligence, courage, and independence was not just tolerated, but valued. Among pirates, the qualities that might have made him a difficult subordinate in conventional settings made him a natural leader. The Caribbean islands where Vane completed his transformation into a pirate captain were unlike anywhere else in the world. The region was a vast archipelago of tropical islands scattered across thousands of square miles of azure water, each one offering its own combination of natural beauty and strategic possibility. Some islands were mountainous, their peaks rising thousands of feet above the sea and shrouded in clouds that generated the rainfall necessary to sustain lush tropical forests. Others were flat coral atolls, barely above sea level, surrounded by reefs that could destroy unwary vessels, but provided perfect hiding places for those who knew their secrets. The human geography of the Caribbean was as complex as its physical features. Spanish colonies dating back to Columbus's voyages controlled the larger islands and most of the mainland coast, drawing enormous wealth from silver mines in Mexico and Peru. English settlements in Jamaica and Barbados had transformed themselves into sugar-producing powerhouses that generated profits rivaling those of the Spanish treasure fleets. French colonies in Martinique and Hispaniola competed with their English neighbours for control of the lucrative sugar trade, while Dutch merchants operated from bases in Curaçao and other smaller islands. But between and around these legitimate colonies existed a shadow world of fugitives, outcasts, and rebels who had found in the Caribbean's remote coves and hidden anchorages a refuge from the authorities who pursued them. Former slaves who had escaped from plantations, deserters from naval and merchant vessels, political refugees from various European conflicts, and men like Vane who had chosen to live outside the law. All of these found shelter in the spaces between competing imperial claims. The pirate community that flourished in this environment was more than just a collection of criminal gangs. It was an alternative civilization with its own customs, laws, and values that often stood in direct opposition to those of the legitimate colonial world. Pirates developed their own forms of democratic governance, with captains elected by their crews and major decisions made through collective deliberation. They created systems for sharing wealth that were more equitable than those used by legitimate merchants and governments. Most importantly, they established codes of conduct that regulated behavior and provided mechanisms for resolving disputes without resort to the arbitrary authority that characterized conventional society. Vane's rise within this pirate civilization was swift and decisive. His experience as a privateer had given him skills that many of his new associates lacked, while his natural charisma and uncompromising principles earned him the respect of men who had little patience for weakness or duplicity. Within months of embracing piracy, he had been elected to positions of significant responsibility within the loose confederation of captains who dominated Caribbean waters. But Vane was not content to be simply another successful pirate captain. He possessed a vision of what piracy could become that went beyond mere criminal enterprise, seeing in it the possibility of creating a genuine alternative to the conventional social order. He began to develop ideas about pirate governance and organization that would influence the entire community and establish him as one of the most significant figures in what historians would later call the Golden Age of Piracy. The center of this pirate civilization was New Providence Island in the Bahamas, a place that nature seemed to have designed specifically for the needs of men who lived outside the law. The island was situated at the crossroads of major shipping lanes, allowing pirates based there to intercept vessels traveling between Europe and the American colonies. Its harbor was deep enough to accommodate large ships, but surrounded by reefs and shoals that made it difficult for hostile forces to approach without local knowledge. More importantly, New Providence existed in a political vacuum that made it perfect for pirate activities. The island was nominally under British control, but the colonial government was too weak and corrupt to pose any serious threat to well-organized pirate operations. The governor, if there was one at any given time, was usually more interested in personal enrichment than effective administration, creating opportunities for corruption and collaboration that enterprising pirates could exploit to their advantage. When Vane first arrived at New Providence, probably sometime in the early 1710s, the island was already well on its way to becoming the unofficial capital of Caribbean piracy. Hundreds of pirates had gathered there, drawn by the combination of strategic location, weak government, and sympathetic population that made it ideal for their purposes. The harbour was crowded with vessels of every description, from small sloops suitable for coastal raiding to large frigates capable of taking on naval warships. The town of Nassau, such as it was, consisted mainly of temporary structures, tents, lean-tos, and crude wooden buildings that could be abandoned quickly if circumstances required. But despite its ramshackle appearance, Nassau was becoming a sophisticated commercial centre where pirates could sell their captured goods, purchase supplies and equipment, and arrange for the services they needed to maintain their vessels and crews. Vane threw himself into this new environment with characteristic energy and ambition. He quickly established himself as one of the more capable and trustworthy captains, earning a reputation for fair dealing with his crew and tactical brilliance in his operations against merchant shipping. His vessels were always well maintained and efficiently operated. His crews were loyal and disciplined, and his captures were consistently profitable. But Vane's true genius lay not in his practical abilities as a pirate captain, but in his understanding of the broader possibilities that the New Providence community represented. He recognized that the pirates had created something unprecedented in the history of the Caribbean, a genuinely independent society that owed allegiance to no European power and operated according to its own laws and customs. This independence was not merely theoretical, but practical and immediate. Pirates at New Providence elected their own leaders, made their own laws, and administered their own justice. They had created their own economy based on the capture and redistribution of wealth from the legitimate colonial system. Most importantly, they had established their own military force, capable of defending their territory against any enemy that might threaten them. Vane understood that this independence was fragile and could be maintained only through constant vigilance and periodic demonstrations of strength. The colonial powers tolerated the pirate community at New Providence only because they lacked the resources or determination to destroy it, not because they accepted its legitimacy. If the pirates grew too comfortable or allowed their defenses to weaken, they would inevitably face coordinated assault from forces that possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers and organization. This understanding led Vane to advocate for a more aggressive and systematic approach to pirate operations than many of his colleagues favored. While some captains were content to conduct sporadic raids that generated immediate profits but attracted minimal attention, Vane argued for coordinated campaigns that would demonstrate pirate power while systematically weakening the colonial authorities who threatened them. His strategy was based on the recognition that the colonial system in the Caribbean was more vulnerable than it appeared? The enormous wealth generated by sugar plantations and silver mines depended on regular maritime commerce between the islands and Europe. Disrupting this commerce through sustained pirate attacks could inflict economic damage far out of proportion to the actual military strength of the pirate forces involved. Moreover, Vane understood that the colonial governments were divided by competing national interests and weakened by endemic corruption and incompetence. Spanish, English, French, and Dutch authorities were often more concerned with fighting each other than with cooperating against the common threat that piracy represented. Pirates who were clever enough to exploit these divisions could play one colonial power against another, securing protection from some authorities while attacking the territories of others. Vane's first independent command was a small sloop that he captured during a carefully planned attack on a Spanish coastal trader. The operation itself was routine by pirate standards, the kind of swift, efficient assault that experienced crews could execute with minimal risk. But Vane's handling of its aftermath revealed the principles that would guide his entire career. Rather than simply distributing the captured goods according to conventional formulas, Vane convened a meeting of his entire crew to discuss how the proceeds should be used. He proposed that a portion of the profits be set aside to create a common fund that could support crew members who were injured or disabled, provide assistance to the families of men who were killed, and finance future operations that might not generate immediate returns. The proposal was radical by the standards of most pirate crews, who typically divided their loot immediately and left each man to fend for himself. But Vane argued persuasively that their long-term survival and success depended on their ability to function as a genuine community rather than a temporary alliance of convenience. His men agreed to the plan, establishing a precedent that would influence pirate organization throughout the Caribbean. Vane also introduced innovations in the governance of his crew that reflected his belief that legitimate authority could only derive from the consent of those subject to it. Traditional naval discipline, with its emphasis on absolute obedience to superior officers, was replaced by a system that gave every crew member a voice in important decisions. Officers were elected rather than appointed, and their authority could be revoked if they lost the confidence of their subordinates. These democratic practices were not merely theoretical commitments, but practical responses to the realities of pirate life. Men who had chosen to live outside the law were unlikely to submit to arbitrary authority, and successful pirate captains had to earn their positions through demonstrated competence and fair dealing. Vane understood this dynamic intuitively and built his leadership style around the recognition that power shared voluntarily was more effective than power imposed through force. The success of these innovations was evident in the extraordinary loyalty that Vane inspired among his followers. Unlike many pirate crews, which were plagued by desertion and internal conflict, his men remained with him through good times and bad, developing an esprit de corps that made them formidable opponents for any enemy they encountered. As Vane's reputation grew, so did the size and sophistication of his operations. His initial sloop was soon joined by additional vessels, creating a small fleet that could operate independently or in coordination depending on circumstances. Each ship was commanded by an officer who had been elected by its crew and who reported to Vane as the overall fleet commander. But the relationship was more collegiate than hierarchical, based on mutual respect and shared objectives rather than rigid military discipline. The crews of these vessels were recruited from throughout the Caribbean, drawing on the most experienced and desperate men available. Former privateers like Vane himself brought technical skills and tactical knowledge that were essential for successful operations. Deserters from naval and merchant vessels contributed practical experience with different types of ships and sailing conditions. Escaped slaves and indentured servants provided knowledge of local geography and sympathetic connections with exploited populations throughout the region. These men brought diverse backgrounds and perspectives to Vane's enterprise, but they were united by their rejection of conventional authority and their commitment to the principles of freedom and self-determination that the pirate community represented. Under Vane's leadership, they developed into one of the most effective fighting forces in the Caribbean, capable of taking on opponents that significantly outnumbered them. The reputation that Vane and his followers earned through their successes was both an asset and a liability. On one hand, it made their operations easier by encouraging merchant captains to surrender without resistance and discouraging colonial authorities from pursuing them too aggressively. Stories of Vane's tactical brilliance and his crew's fierce loyalty spread throughout the Caribbean, creating a psychological advantage that was often more valuable than superior firepower. On the other hand, Vane's growing fame made him a priority target for those authorities and attracted attention from forces that possessed the resources and determination necessary to pose a genuine threat. Colonial governors who might have been content to ignore less notorious pirates began to view Vane as a challenge to their authority that could not be tolerated. The most significant early test of Vane's leadership came in 1715, when a coordinated expedition of Spanish and English vessels attempted to destroy the pirate stronghold at New Providence. The attack was the result of diplomatic cooperation between the two colonial powers, who had temporarily set aside their mutual hostility to address the common threat that Caribbean piracy represented to their commercial interests. The assault force consisted of 5 warships carrying a total of nearly 200 cannons and more than 1,000 soldiers and sailors. It was a formidable armada that possessed overwhelming superiority in conventional military terms, but the pirates had several advantages that partially offset their numerical disadvantage. First, they knew the local waters intimately, understanding every reef, current, and channel that could affect naval operations in the area. This knowledge allowed them to position their forces in ways that maximized their defensive advantages while minimizing their exposure to enemy fire. Second, the pirate community at New Providence was highly motivated to resist the attack, understanding that defeat would mean death or imprisonment for most of them. They fought with the desperation of men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from victory. Most importantly, the pirates had developed a sophisticated system of communication and coordination that allowed them to respond quickly to changing tactical situations. Unlike the attacking fleet, which was hampered by rigid military hierarchy and the difficulties of coordinating between vessels from different national traditions, the pirates could adapt their tactics on the fly as circumstances required. Vane played a crucial role in organizing the defense of New Providence, using his tactical expertise and leadership abilities to coordinate the efforts of captains who were more accustomed to operating independently. He established a unified command structure that allowed the pirates to function as a coherent military force while maintaining the democratic principles that were fundamental to their community. The battle itself lasted for 3 days, with the attacking fleet attempting to bombard the pirate stronghold into submission, while the defenders used their superior knowledge of local conditions to launch counterattacks that inflicted significant damage on the enemy vessels. Vane's forces were particularly effective in using small boats to attack the larger enemy ships during the hours of darkness, when their local knowledge gave them decisive advantages. The turning point came when Vane led a daring night attack that succeeded in capturing one of the enemy's smaller warships, a coup that not only provided the pirates with additional firepower, but also demonstrated their ability to defeat conventional naval forces through superior tactics and determination. The psychological impact of this victory was enormous, convincing many of the attacking force that they faced opponents who could not be easily defeated. Faced with mounting casualties and the evident determination of the pirate defenders, the commanders of the attacking fleet decided to withdraw rather than continue a siege that was proving far more costly than they had anticipated. The retreat was a devastating blow to colonial prestige and a tremendous victory for the pirate community, establishing New Providence as a virtually impregnable stronghold that could resist even coordinated assault by superior forces. Vane's role in this victory established him as one of the most respected leaders in the pirate community, a man whose strategic vision and tactical brilliance had preserved their independence at a moment of supreme crisis. But the victory also revealed the fundamental contradiction that would eventually destroy the pirate republic. Their success in defeating external enemies made them increasingly attractive targets for more determined and better organized opposition. The defeat of the 1715 expedition convinced colonial authorities throughout the Caribbean that conventional military methods were insufficient to deal with the pirate threat. New strategies would be needed, approaches that combined military pressure with political inducements, and that exploited the internal divisions within the pirate community rather than treating it as a monolithic enemy. These new strategies would eventually culminate in the appointment of Woodes Rogers as governor of the Bahamas in 1718, with a specific mandate to suppress piracy in the region. Rogers was a formidable opponent who combined extensive maritime experience with strong political connections and adequate financial resources. More importantly, he understood the pirate community well enough to develop effective strategies for combating it. But in the immediate aftermath of the 1715 victory, Vane and his fellow pirates enjoyed a period of unprecedented success and influence. Their demonstration of military capability had earned them a kind of grudging respect from colonial authorities, who began to treat them more like a legitimate government than a simple criminal organization. Some officials even entered into informal negotiations with pirate leaders, seeking to arrange truces or mutual non-aggression pacts that would protect their own territories while allowing the pirates to operate elsewhere. Vane used this period of relative security to expand his operations and refine his methods. His fleet grew from a handful of vessels to a squadron of more than a dozen ships, ranging from small sloops suitable for coastal raiding to large frigates capable of taking on naval warships. His crews were recruited from throughout the Atlantic world, drawing on experienced sailors from every European nation, as well as former slaves who had won their freedom through rebellion or escape. These men brought diverse skills and perspectives to Vane's enterprise, but they were united by their commitment to the principles of freedom and self-determination that the pirate community represented. Under Vane's leadership, they developed into one of the most formidable fighting forces in the Caribbean, capable of projecting power across thousands of miles of ocean and challenging the authority of colonial governments throughout the region. The operations that Vane conducted during this period were notable not just for their scale and success, but for their systematic nature. Rather than conducting random raids motivated purely by greed, he began to implement coordinated campaigns designed to achieve specific strategic objectives. His attacks were carefully planned to disrupt colonial commerce, weaken government authority, and demonstrate pirate power in ways that would discourage future opposition. One of Vane's most ambitious operations during this period was a sustained campaign against Spanish shipping in the Gulf of Mexico, an area that had previously been considered too dangerous for pirate operations because of the heavy naval patrols that protected the treasure fleets traveling between Mexico and Spain. But Vane had developed new tactics that allowed his forces to operate successfully, even in heavily defended waters. The key to his success was the use of intelligence networks that provided advance warning of Spanish fleet movements and the locations of the richest targets. Vane had cultivated contacts throughout the Spanish colonial system, including corrupt officials who provided information in exchange for bribes and shares of captured treasure. He also worked with merchants in neutral ports who served as intermediaries for the sale of captured goods and the purchase of supplies and equipment. These networks allowed Vane to position his forces to intercept Spanish vessels at their most vulnerable moments, when they were separated from their escorts or caught in weather conditions that favored the pirates' superior speed and maneuverability. His attacks were swift and devastating, designed to capture maximum treasure with minimum risk to his own forces. The most spectacular success of this campaign was the capture of the treasure ship Nuestra Señora de los Remedios in September 1716, a vessel carrying silver worth more than 200,000 pieces of eight from the mines of Potosi to the royal treasury in Madrid. The attack took place during a fierce storm that had separated the treasure ship from its naval escort, leaving it vulnerable to the kind of coordinated assault that Vane's forces had perfected. The capture was executed with characteristic precision and audacity. Vane's ships approached their target under cover of the storm, using the limited visibility to get within close range before the Spanish crew realized they were under attack. The boarding action was brief but decisive, with the Spanish sailors overwhelmed by the pirates' superior numbers and fighting skill. But the real significance of the capture lay not in its immediate material value, but in its psychological and political impact. The loss of such an enormous treasure was a devastating blow to Spanish prestige and a demonstration of pirate power that could not be ignored by colonial authorities throughout the Caribbean. It proved that even the most heavily defended Spanish vessels were vulnerable to well-planned pirate attacks, and that the colonial governments lacked the resources to provide adequate protection for their most valuable shipping. The success of the Nuestra Señora de los Remedios capture also established Vane as one of the wealthiest and most powerful pirate captains in the Caribbean. His share of the treasure, distributed according to the democratic principles that governed his fleet, was enormous by the standards of the time. But he used his new wealth not for personal luxury, but to expand his operations and strengthen his position within the pirate community. Vane invested heavily in new ships and equipment, recruiting additional crew members and establishing new bases of operation throughout the Caribbean. He also used his wealth to cultivate political relationships with colonial officials who could provide protection and support for his activities. Most importantly, he began to develop a long-term strategy for transforming the pirate community from a collection of independent captains into a unified political entity capable of challenging colonial authority on equal terms. This vision of pirate confederation was Vane's most significant contribution to the development of Caribbean piracy. He understood that individual captains, however successful, were ultimately vulnerable to the superior resources that colonial governments could bring to bear against them. Only by uniting under common leadership and pursuing coordinated strategies could the pirates hope to maintain their independence and continue their challenge to the established order. The practical implementation of this vision required Vane to overcome significant obstacles, not least of which was the fierce independence that characterized most pirate captains. These men had chosen piracy precisely because they refused to submit to external authority, and convincing them to accept any form of unified command required extraordinary diplomatic skill and political acumen. Vane's approach to this challenge revealed his sophisticated understanding of human psychology and group dynamics. Rather than attempting to impose unity through force or coercion, he sought to create it through persuasion and mutual interest. He organized regular meetings of pirate captains where strategic issues could be discussed and collective decisions made through democratic deliberation. These gatherings, which became known as councils of war, were held at various locations throughout the Caribbean, with the specific site chosen to ensure that no single captain or faction could dominate the proceedings. The discussions were often heated and contentious, reflecting the strong personalities and conflicting interests of the participants, but they gradually developed into a sophisticated system of consultation and coordination. Vane's role in these councils was not as a dictator or supreme commander, but as a facilitator and strategist who could articulate common interests and develop plans that served the needs of the entire pirate community. His reputation for tactical brilliance and fair dealing earned him the respect of his fellow captains, while his democratic principles ensured that no one felt their independence was being threatened by his leadership. The success of this confederation was evident in the increasingly sophisticated and coordinated nature of pirate operations throughout the Caribbean. Instead of random raids conducted by individual captains, the pirates began to implement strategic campaigns that disrupted colonial commerce on a regional scale. They established permanent bases at key locations, created intelligence networks that spanned the entire Caribbean, and developed supply lines that allowed them to sustain operations far from their home ports. Most importantly, the Confederation gave the pirates a political voice that individual captains had lacked. When colonial governments attempted to negotiate with the pirate community, they now faced a unified leadership that could speak for thousands of men and dozens of ships. This political recognition, however grudging, marked a significant shift in the relationship between pirates and colonial authorities. But the very success of Vane's confederation also created new vulnerabilities and challenges. The unity and coordination that made the pirates more effective also made them more visible and more threatening to colonial authorities. Individual captains operating independently could be ignored or dealt with through routine law enforcement measures. But a unified pirate confederation represented a genuine challenge to colonial authority that could not be tolerated indefinitely. Moreover, the democratic principles that held the Confederation together also made it vulnerable to internal division and manipulation by external enemies. Colonial authorities began to develop more sophisticated strategies for dealing with the pirate threat, approaches that combined military pressure with political inducements designed to exploit the divisions within the pirate community. The most significant of these new strategies was the appointment of Woodes Rogers as governor of the Bahamas in 1718, with specific instructions to suppress piracy in the region through whatever means necessary. Rogers was a formidable opponent who understood both the strengths and weaknesses of the pirate community, having served as a privateer himself during Queen Anne's War. Rogers's approach was more sophisticated than the crude military expeditions that had previously been mounted against the pirates. He combined the threat of military action with offers of royal pardons for pirates who agreed to abandon their careers, creating a two-pronged strategy that exploited the fundamental tensions within the pirate community between those who saw piracy as a way of life and those who viewed it as a temporary means to an end. The announcement of Rogers' appointment and his planned arrival in the Bahamas created a crisis within the pirate confederation that would ultimately tear it apart. Some captains, including many of Vane's oldest associates, saw the royal pardons as an opportunity to escape from piracy with their lives and fortunes intact. Others, led by Vane himself, viewed the pardons as a betrayal of everything the pirate community had stood for. The philosophical disagreement between these factions reflected deeper tensions about the ultimate meaning and purpose of piracy that had been developing beneath the surface of the Confederation's apparent unity. For pragmatists like Benjamin Hornigold, who had been instrumental in establishing the new Providence community, piracy had always been primarily a means to an end, a way of accumulating wealth and status that could eventually be converted into respectability within conventional society. For idealists like Vane, piracy had become an end in itself, a way of life that represented a fundamental rejection of the values and assumptions that governed civilized society. He argued that accepting Rogers's pardons would betray everything that the pirate community had achieved, reducing their grand experiment in alternative governance to nothing more than a temporary criminal enterprise. The debate over how to respond to Rogers's challenge consumed the pirate community for months, with Vane emerging as the leader of the faction that favored continued resistance. He argued his position with characteristic eloquence and passion, contending that the pirates had created something unique and valuable that should not be abandoned simply because it faced temporary difficulties. "We came here as free men," Vane declared to a gathering of captains in Nassau's largest tavern, "and we built something that the world has never seen before, a society where a man's worth is determined by his deeds rather than his birth, where authority derives from consent rather than force, where the wealth of the earth is shared among those who risk their lives to obtain it. Are we now to throw all of this away for the promise of royal mercy from men who would have hanged us without trial just months ago?" Vane's words resonated powerfully with many of his listeners, particularly the younger pirates who had known no life other than the one they had built at New Providence. But they were opposed by more pragmatic voices who pointed out that ideological purity was a luxury that might cost them their lives. Benjamin Hornigold, despite his long friendship with Vane, argued forcefully for acceptance of Rogers's terms. "We achieved what we set out to achieve," he contended. "We proved that men could live free and prosper without bowing to kings and governors. But we always knew that this life could not last forever. The world is changing around us, and we must change with it or be destroyed. Rogers offers us a chance to keep our lives and our fortunes. Only a fool would reject such an offer out of pride." The divisions within the pirate community became increasingly bitter as Rogers's deadline for accepting pardons approached. Former allies found themselves on opposite sides of an ideological divide that seemed impossible to bridge. Crews began to split along factional lines, with some men choosing to follow captains who favored surrender, while others remained loyal to leaders who advocated continued resistance. Vane's own position was complicated by defections among his most trusted lieutenants. Several captains who had served under his command for years chose to accept Rogers's pardons, taking significant portions of the Confederation's military strength with them. These defections were personal betrayals for Vane, but they also reflected the broader crisis of confidence that was affecting the entire pirate community. The final confrontation between the two factions came in July 1718, when Rogers arrived in Nassau Harbor with a small fleet of naval vessels and a royal proclamation offering pardons to all pirates who submitted within a specified time period. The governor's arrival forced every captain to make an immediate choice between submission and resistance, with no possibility of compromise or delay. Vane's response to Rogers's arrival revealed both his courage and his uncompromising nature. While other captains hesitated or sought to negotiate, Vane immediately declared his intention to resist regardless of the consequences. He gathered his loyal followers and prepared to fight his way out of Nassau Harbour, understanding that staying would mean either surrender or destruction. The escape from Nassau became one of the most dramatic episodes in Vane's career, demonstrating both his tactical brilliance and his absolute refusal to compromise his principles. Rogers had positioned his naval vessels to block the harbour's main entrance, confident that he could trap the remaining pirates and force them to surrender. But Vane had prepared for this possibility, studying the complex geography of Nassau Harbour and identifying alternative escape routes that could be used in an emergency. The breakout began at dawn on July 24th, 1718, when Vane's flagship and 2 accompanying vessels suddenly emerged from their concealed anchorage and made a desperate run for the open sea. Rogers's ships immediately gave chase, confident that they could overtake the heavily loaded pirate vessels before they could reach the safety of the open ocean. But Vane had anticipated this pursuit and prepared for it accordingly. His ships had been stripped of all unnecessary weight and equipped with additional sails that gave them crucial advantages in speed and maneuverability. More importantly, his crews included some of the most experienced sailors in the Caribbean, men who could coax maximum performance from their vessels even under the most demanding conditions. The chase continued for several hours, with Rogers's naval vessels gradually closing the distance as they pursued Vane's ships across the shallow waters that surrounded New Providence. At several points, it appeared that the pirates would be overtaken and forced to fight a hopeless battle against superior numbers and firepower. But Vane's knowledge of local waters proved decisive in the crucial moments. As the pursuing vessels closed to within cannon range, Vane led his ships through a narrow channel between 2 coral reefs that he had scouted months earlier as a potential escape route. The passage was so dangerous that only someone with intimate knowledge of its hazards could navigate it successfully, and Rogers's captains were forced to abandon their pursuit rather than risk destroying their ships on the hidden reefs. The successful escape from Nassau was a tactical victory for Vane, but it was also a strategic disaster that marked the effective end of the pirate confederation he had worked so hard to build. He was now an outlaw, even among outlaws, cut off from the bases and supply networks that had made his previous operations possible. His fleet had been reduced to 3 vessels with fewer than 200 men, a tiny force compared to the thousands who had once acknowledged his leadership. More significantly, Vane's escape had eliminated any possibility of compromise or negotiation with colonial authorities. Rogers and other officials could no longer treat him as a potential partner in some face-saving arrangement, but only as an implacable enemy who had to be destroyed. The man who had once been seen as a possible negotiating partner was now marked for death or capture, with substantial bounties placed on his head by governments throughout the Caribbean. But Vane's response to these desperate circumstances revealed the qualities that had made him a legendary figure among his followers. Rather than accepting defeat or seeking some accommodation with his enemies, he chose to continue fighting with the same uncompromising determination that had characterized his entire career. If the pirate confederation could not be preserved, he would at least demonstrate that the spirit of resistance it had embodied could not be easily extinguished. The operations that Vane conducted during the months following his escape from Nassau took on an almost symbolic character, as if he were determined to prove that piracy could survive even when stripped of its material advantages. His attacks became more audacious and more theatrical, designed not just to capture wealth, but to demonstrate that the colonial authorities who claimed to have defeated him were still vulnerable to a man who refused to acknowledge their authority. One of the most spectacular of these operations was Vane's capture of the merchant ship Samuel in October 1718, an attack that was notable not for its material value, but for its psychological impact. The Samuel was carrying a cargo of manufactured goods from London to Charleston, valuable enough to make its capture worthwhile, but not sufficiently important to warrant heavy naval protection. But the circumstances of the attack transformed a routine pirate operation into a dramatic demonstration of Vane's continued defiance of colonial authority. The capture took place within sight of Charleston Harbor, where Rogers's naval vessels were anchored as part of a coordinated campaign to suppress piracy throughout the region. Vane's ships appeared suddenly out of the morning mist, captured their target with swift efficiency, and disappeared again before the naval vessels could mount an effective pursuit. The audacity of the attack sent shockwaves through the colonial establishment throughout the Americas. Here was proof that despite all their efforts and expenditures, the authorities still could not protect merchant shipping from a pirate captain who had been officially declared defeated months earlier. The psychological impact of this demonstration was enormous, inspiring other pirates throughout the Caribbean, while undermining confidence in the effectiveness of anti-piracy measures. But Vane's success in these operations came at enormous personal cost. The constant pressure of being hunted by superior forces was taking its toll on both his physical health and his mental state. The man who had once been known for his calm judgment and strategic thinking was becoming increasingly erratic, prone to fits of rage that alternated with periods of brooding melancholy. More troubling was the way that Vane's commitment to his principles was beginning to manifest itself in increasingly extreme behavior toward those who opposed him. Where he had once been content to capture and release merchant sailors after robbing their vessels, he now sometimes subjected them to cruel treatment that seemed designed more to satisfy his own frustration than to achieve any practical objective. These changes in Vane's character reflected the impossible position in which he found himself. He had staked everything on a vision of piracy as a noble alternative to conventional society. But the reality of his situation was forcing him to behave in ways that contradicted his own ideals. The man who had fought for freedom and equality was becoming a tyrant, ruling his remaining followers through fear rather than the democratic consensus that had characterized his earlier leadership. The internal contradictions of Vane's position became apparent to his own crew, many of whom began to question whether their captain was still the man they had chosen to follow. Desertions became common, with experienced sailors slipping away at every opportunity to seek more promising situations elsewhere. Even among those who remained loyal, there was growing concern about Vane's judgment and doubt about his increasingly unpredictable behavior. The crisis came to a head in November 1718, when Vane made the decision that would effectively end his career as a pirate captain. His ships encountered a French warship off the coast of Jamaica, a vessel that significantly outgunned Vane's fleet, but was not obviously superior enough to make resistance hopeless. In the past, Vane would have carefully evaluated the tactical situation and made a calculated decision about whether to fight or flee based on his assessment of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the opposing forces. But on this occasion, Vane chose to avoid battle, despite the protests of many of his crew members, who argued that the French vessel could be taken if they attacked with sufficient determination. His refusal to fight was seen by many of his followers as evidence that their captain had lost the courage and fighting spirit that had made him legendary throughout the Caribbean. The controversy over this decision split Vane's remaining crew and provided an opportunity for his enemies within his own ranks to challenge his leadership. Robert Deal, one of Vane's most trusted lieutenants, argued that their captain's excessive caution was leading them all toward destruction. In a bitter confrontation that revealed how far Vane had fallen from his earlier democratic ideals, Deal accused him of betraying the very principles he claimed to defend. "You speak of courage," Deal told Vane during the heated meeting where the crew voted on his continued leadership. "But you run from fights that we could win. You speak of democracy, but you ignore the will of your own men when it conflicts with your fears. You have become the very thing you once fought against, a tyrant who demands obedience without earning it." Vane's response to this challenge revealed both his continued charisma and his growing detachment from reality. Rather than accepting the crew's decision or attempting to negotiate some compromise, he chose to fight for his position with the same uncompromising determination that had characterized his resistance to Rogers. The result was a violent confrontation that split his already weakened force and left several men dead. In the end, Vane was overthrown by the majority of his crew and replaced as captain by Deal, who immediately changed course toward New Providence in hopes of negotiating some accommodation with Rogers's administration. Vane and the handful of men who remained loyal to him were put ashore on a small island off the coast of Honduras, marooned with minimal supplies and no prospect of rescue. The marooning of Charles Vane marked the effective end of his career as a pirate captain and the beginning of a final chapter that would be marked by desperation, degradation, and ultimate tragedy. The island where he found himself was a tiny speck of sand and coral in the vast expanse of the Caribbean, barely large enough to support human life and completely isolated from the shipping lanes where rescue might be possible. For a man who had spent his adult life in constant motion across the waters of the Caribbean, this enforced isolation was a fate worse than death. Vane had always defined himself through action and leadership, through his ability to command men and ships in the pursuit of freedom and wealth. Stripped of these defining characteristics, he was forced to confront the fundamental questions about identity and purpose that he had previously been able to avoid through constant activity. The physical challenges of survival on the island were severe, but not insurmountable. There was fresh water from occasional rainfall, fish and shellfish could be caught in the surrounding waters, and tropical fruits provided some nutritional variety. But the psychological challenges were far more difficult to overcome. Vane found himself with nothing to do but think about the choices that had led him to this desperate situation, and the conclusions he reached were not comforting. He had sacrificed everything: his wealth, his followers, his reputation, and ultimately his freedom, for the sake of principles that now seemed abstract and meaningless in the face of his current reality. The democratic ideals that had once seemed so important meant nothing when there was no society to govern. The independence he had prized so highly had become mere isolation, cutting him off from the human connections that gave life meaning and purpose. But even in his extremity, Vane could not bring himself to repudiate the choices he had made, or to express regret for the path he had chosen. He remained convinced that his resistance to Rogers and the colonial authorities had been morally justified, even if it had proven practically unsuccessful. The fact that his ideals had led to his destruction did not, in his mind, invalidate those ideals or suggest that he should have chosen differently. This stubborn adherence to principle sustained Vane through the long months of his island exile, but it also prevented him from taking practical steps that might have improved his situation. He refused to signal passing ships for rescue, fearing that any vessel he encountered would be controlled by his enemies and would lead only to capture and execution. He rejected the possibility of constructing a raft or boat that might allow him to reach inhabited islands, convinced that such an attempt would end in disaster. Instead, Vane remained on his island prison, slowly deteriorating both physically and mentally as the months passed, without hope of rescue or change. His companions, the few men who had remained loyal to him when his crew mutinied, gradually succumbed to disease and despair, leaving him increasingly alone with his thoughts and his regrets. The exact details of Vane's final months are largely unknown, lost in the anonymity that claims most men who die far from civilization and outside the bounds of recorded history. What few accounts exist suggest that he was eventually captured by Spanish authorities who found him on his island, reduced to a skeletal figure barely recognizable as the man who had once terrorized Caribbean waters. The Spanish, recognizing him despite his degraded condition, transported him to Jamaica, where he was tried and convicted of piracy by the British colonial authorities. The trial was largely a formality, as Vane's identity and guilt were well established, but it provided an opportunity for the colonial government to demonstrate its determination to suppress piracy through the full application of legal authority. Charles Vane was executed by hanging in Port Royal, Jamaica, on March 29, 1721, nearly 3 years after his escape from Nassau and his final break with the colonial authorities who had sought his destruction. He was approximately 40 years old at the time of his death, though the exact date of his birth remains uncertain. His execution was public and well attended, serving as both entertainment for the colonial population and a warning to other potential pirates about the fate that awaited those who challenged legitimate authority. Contemporary accounts of Vane's execution suggest that he maintained his defiant attitude to the very end, refusing to express repentance for his crimes or to provide information that might be useful to the authorities in their continuing campaign against piracy. His final words, if accurately recorded, reflected the uncompromising principles that had guided his entire adult life, and ultimately led to his destruction. "I chose to live as a free man rather than die as a slave," he reportedly declared from the scaffold, "and I regret nothing except that my death serves the interests of tyrants who would deny freedom to all men. Let those who come after me remember that some things are worth dying for, and that the spirit of liberty cannot be killed even when its defenders are destroyed." Whether these words were actually spoken by Vane or were invented by later writers seeking to create a dramatic conclusion to his story, they accurately reflected the philosophical position that had defined his career and shaped his fate. He had indeed chosen to live as a free man according to his own understanding of that term, and he had paid the ultimate price for that choice. The death of Charles Vane marked the end of one of the most uncompromising careers in the history of Caribbean piracy, but it also symbolized the broader transformation that was occurring throughout the region during the early 18th century. The Golden Age of Piracy that had begun with the end of Queen Anne's War in 1713 was coming to a close, destroyed by the same forces of modernization and centralization that were reshaping the entire Atlantic world. The colonial authorities who had pursued Vane and his fellow pirates were not simply enforcing law and order for its own sake, but were implementing a broader program of rationalization and control that sought to eliminate all forms of unauthorized activity that might interfere with the orderly development of commercial society. Pirates represented more than just criminals to these authorities. They embodied an alternative vision of social organization that challenged the fundamental assumptions on which colonial civilization was based. In the immediate aftermath of Vane's execution, colonial officials throughout the Caribbean celebrated what they saw as a decisive victory over the forces of chaos and lawlessness. The man who had once commanded fleets and challenged governors was dead, his followers were scattered or captured, and the pirate confederation he had helped build was effectively destroyed. Trade became safer, administration more efficient, and the rule of law more predictable. But the elimination of piracy also eliminated something that had made the Caribbean unique in the Atlantic world: the possibility that outcasts and rebels could create alternative societies based on different principles and values. The islands became more prosperous and more peaceful, but they also became more predictable and more constrained. The spirit of adventure and experimentation that had characterized the age of piracy was replaced by the careful calculation and risk aversion that marked the triumph of commercial civilization. The transformation of Charles Vane from historical figure to legendary symbol began almost immediately after his death, as sailors and storytellers throughout the Caribbean began to elaborate on the known facts of his career. The man who had refused to compromise his principles became a folk hero for men who felt trapped by the constraints of conventional society, a reminder that it was possible to reject the authority of kings and governors, even if such rejection ultimately led to destruction. These stories served important psychological functions for people who lived under conditions of harsh authority and limited freedom. Vane's legend provided them with a model of absolute resistance, proof that it was possible to maintain one's integrity and independence even in the face of overwhelming opposition. His example showed that defeat could be transformed into victory through the simple act of refusing to surrender one's essential humanity. The process of mythologization was accelerated by the fact that relatively few reliable details about Vane's life were available to later generations. Unlike some of his more famous contemporaries, he had left behind no personal writings or detailed contemporary accounts that might have complicated the process of legendary creation. This absence of hard facts allowed storytellers to project their own values and aspirations onto his memory, creating a figure who embodied whatever qualities they most admired or needed to believe in. The Vane of popular legend became a more simplified and more heroic figure than the complex and sometimes contradictory man who had actually lived and died in the early 18th century. The historical Vane had been capable of both generosity and cruelty, wisdom and folly, democratic leadership and tyrannical behavior. The legendary Vane was transformed into a pure symbol of resistance to oppression, stripped of the ambiguities and contradictions that had characterized his actual personality. This simplification was perhaps inevitable, as the specific political and social contexts that had shaped Vane's career became less relevant to later generations. The complex struggles between different European powers for control of Caribbean territories, the economic forces that had created the plantation system, the legal and philosophical questions surrounding privateering and piracy, all of these gradually faded from popular memory, leaving behind only the basic narrative of a man who had chosen freedom over security and had paid the ultimate price for that choice. Yet even in its simplified form, Vane's legend continued to carry important political and cultural meanings. During the American Revolution, colonial rebels found inspiration in stories of pirates who had successfully defied British authority, seeing in them precursors to their own struggle for independence. Abolitionists pointed to the democratic practices of pirate communities as evidence that racial equality was both possible and natural when artificial legal barriers were removed. Throughout the 19th century, as industrialization transformed the social and economic landscape of the Atlantic world, Vane's story continued to resonate with people who felt displaced or alienated by the pace of change. He represented a time when individual courage and determination could still matter, when small groups of committed men could challenge powerful institutions and sometimes prevail through superior wit and audacity. The Romantic movement in literature and art found particular inspiration in Vane's story, seeing in him an embodiment of the noble savage who preserved natural human virtues in the face of civilizational corruption. Writers like Lord Byron and Sir Walter Scott drew on pirate legends to create fictional characters who combined criminal behavior with heroic qualities, suggesting that conventional morality was often inferior to natural honor and spontaneous generosity. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Vane's legacy was his demonstration that alternative forms of social organization were not only possible, but could be successfully implemented under the right circumstances. The pirate communities of the early 18th century had proven that democratic governance, economic equality, and racial integration could work in practice, not just in theory. They had created societies that were more egalitarian and more just than the conventional civilizations from which their members had fled. This achievement was all the more remarkable because it had been accomplished by men who were generally considered to be the dregs of society, criminals, outcasts, and rebels who had been rejected by conventional civilization. Their success suggested that the fault lay not with human nature itself, but with the artificial institutions and social arrangements that prevented people from realizing their full potential. The tragedy of Vane and his fellow pirates was not that they had failed to create something better than conventional society, but that they had been unable to sustain their achievements in the face of superior organization and resources. Their communities had been destroyed not because they were inherently flawed, but because they posed too great a challenge to the established order to be tolerated. This lesson was not lost on later generations of social reformers and revolutionaries who studied the pirate experiments as examples of both the possibilities and the limitations of radical social change. The pirates had shown what was possible when men were free to organize themselves according to their own values and interests, but they had also demonstrated the importance of building sustainable institutions that could survive external pressure. The influence of pirate examples can be traced through many subsequent movements for social and political change, from the democratic revolutions of the late 18th century through the socialist and anarchist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. Each generation found in the pirate legacy whatever inspiration and guidance it needed for its own struggles against authority and oppression. But the memory of Charles Vane also carried warnings about the costs and dangers of uncompromising resistance to established authority. His story showed that principle carried to extremes could become self-destructive, that the refusal to accept any compromise or accommodation could lead to isolation and ultimate defeat. The man who had begun his career as a successful leader of democratic communities had ended it as a lonely exile, destroyed by his own rigidity and inability to adapt to changing circumstances. This aspect of Vane's legacy was particularly relevant to later revolutionaries and reformers who faced similar temptations to sacrifice practical effectiveness for ideological purity. His example suggested that successful social change required not just courage and commitment, but also flexibility and political wisdom, the ability to distinguish between core principles that could never be compromised and tactical positions that might be adjusted as circumstances required. The locations associated with Vane's career became pilgrimage sites of sorts for people who were drawn to his legend and the broader pirate tradition. New Providence Island, where he had helped establish the most successful pirate community in history, remained a symbol of democratic possibility long after the pirates themselves had been driven away or killed. Visitors to the island could still see the ruins of the fortifications that had protected the pirate stronghold, and imagine what life might have been like in a society governed by elected leaders and democratic assemblies. The waters off Honduras where Vane had been marooned became part of the romantic geography of pirate legend, a place where the harsh realities of outlaw life could be contemplated and the costs of absolute resistance understood. Ships passing through these waters carried passengers who knew the story of the pirate captain who had chosen isolation and death rather than surrender his principles, and who drew their own lessons from his example. Port Royal, Jamaica, where Vane had been executed, preserved the scaffold where he had died as a tourist attraction and historical monument. The site served as a reminder of the ultimate fate that awaited those who challenged established authority, but it also commemorated the courage of men who had been willing to die for their beliefs. The ambiguous message of the memorial reflected the complex legacy that Vane and his fellow pirates had left to later generations. But perhaps the most important memorial to Charles Vane was not physical, but cultural. The continued vitality of democratic ideals and practices that had been nurtured in the pirate communities of the early 18th century. The principles of elected leadership, collective decision-making, and equitable distribution of wealth that had characterized pirate society were gradually incorporated into the mainstream political culture of the Atlantic world, though usually without acknowledgement of their origins in criminal communities. The democratic revolutions that swept through Europe and the Americas in the late 18th and early 19th centuries drew on intellectual traditions that could be traced back through Enlightenment philosophy to earlier experiments in self-governance, including those conducted by pirates in the Caribbean. The idea that legitimate government required the consent of the governed, which became fundamental to modern democratic theory, had been put into practice by pirate communities decades before it was formally articulated by political philosophers. Similarly, the economic principles that pirates had developed to ensure fair distribution of wealth and opportunity influenced later movements for social and economic reform. The pirate practice of sharing booty according to agreed-upon formulas anticipated many of the cooperative and socialist arrangements that would be proposed by 19th-century reformers. Their insistence that leadership positions be elected rather than inherited challenged aristocratic assumptions that would not be fully overthrown in Europe until much later. Most importantly, the pirates had demonstrated that racial and ethnic divisions need not prevent successful cooperation and shared governance. Pirate crews included men of many different backgrounds: Europeans, Africans, Native Americans, and people of mixed ancestry, who worked together on terms of relative equality that were unimaginable in conventional colonial society. Their example provided evidence that racial prejudice was not a natural or inevitable aspect of human behavior, but a social construction that could be overcome under the right circumstances. This achievement was particularly significant because it occurred at a time when racial slavery was becoming more entrenched and more systematized throughout the Americas. While colonial society was developing increasingly rigid hierarchies based on race and ancestry, pirate communities were proving that alternative arrangements were both possible and practical. Their success provided ammunition for later abolitionists who argued that racial equality was not only morally right, but socially feasible. The gradual incorporation of pirate innovations into mainstream political culture was rarely acknowledged by the respectable reformers who adopted them. Democratic politicians preferred to trace their ideas back to classical antiquity or Enlightenment philosophy, rather than to acknowledge any debt to criminal communities that had been officially condemned and suppressed. But the influence was real nonetheless, transmitted through cultural channels that operated below the level of formal political discourse. Sailors who had served on pirate ships carried their experiences into merchant and naval service, where they influenced the development of more democratic practices and attitudes. Colonial officials who had dealt with pirate communities learned lessons about governance and negotiation that they applied in other contexts. Merchants who had traded with pirates discovered that business could be conducted successfully on more equitable terms than those typically imposed by conventional commercial relationships. The transformation of Charles Vane from a specific historical individual into a symbol of resistance and democratic possibility was completed during the 19th century, as the particular circumstances of his life became less important than the general principles he was thought to represent. By this time, the complex political and economic contexts that had shaped early 18th century piracy were largely forgotten, leaving behind only the basic narrative of men who had chosen freedom over security and had created democratic communities in the face of overwhelming opposition. This simplified narrative was more powerful in some ways than the complex historical reality it replaced, because it could be applied to new situations and adapted to changing circumstances. Each generation could find in Vane's story whatever inspiration and guidance it needed for its own struggles, without being constrained by the specific details of his actual life and career. The legend of Charles Vane became part of the cultural heritage that democratic movements drew upon in their struggles against various forms of oppression and exploitation. His example was invoked by labor organizers fighting for workers' rights, by colonial peoples seeking independence from imperial rule, by civil rights activists challenging racial discrimination, and by many other groups who saw in his story a model of principled resistance to unjust authority. But the legend also carried warnings about the costs and limitations of such resistance. Vane's ultimate failure and death served as reminders that courage and principle, while necessary for social change, were not sufficient by themselves. Successful reform required not just the willingness to challenge authority, but also the political skill to build sustainable alternatives and the tactical flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. The continuing relevance of Vane's story to later generations suggested that the fundamental tensions he had confronted between individual freedom and social order, between democratic ideals and practical necessities, between moral principle and political effectiveness, remained unresolved in modern society. Each generation faced similar choices about how much to compromise with existing institutions and how much to resist in the name of higher principles. The waters of the Caribbean, where Charles Vane had lived and died, continued to flow with their ancient rhythms, indifferent to the human dramas that had played out on their surface. Ships still sailed these waters, carrying goods and passengers between the islands and the mainland. But they moved now under the protection of modern governments and international law. The age of great pirate confederations was long past, destroyed by the same forces of modernization and centralization that had transformed the entire world. But something of Vane's spirit survived in the stories that people told and the ideals they cherished. His legend had become part of the collective memory of democratic struggle, a reminder that alternative forms of social organization were possible if people had the courage to imagine and create them. The specific circumstances of his rebellion might be irrelevant to modern conditions, but the spirit of resistance and experimentation he embodied remained as relevant as ever. The tragedy of Charles Vane was that he had been born too early to see the ultimate vindication of many of the principles he had died defending. The democratic ideals that had gotten him hanged as a criminal would eventually become the foundation of legitimate government throughout much of the world. The economic equality he had sought to create would inspire generations of reformers and revolutionaries. The racial integration he had practiced would eventually be recognized as both morally right and socially beneficial. But Vane's tragedy was also his triumph. He had lived and died according to his own principles, refusing to compromise his vision of human dignity and possibility, even when such compromise might have saved his life. His example showed that some values were worth preserving, even at the ultimate cost, and that the pursuit of justice and freedom could give meaning to life, even when it led to death. In the end, Charles Vane's greatest achievement wasn't any particular victory he had won or any specific reform he had implemented, but the demonstration he had provided that ordinary people could challenge extraordinary power if they possessed sufficient courage and commitment. He had shown that alternative societies were possible, that democratic governance could work, and that human beings were capable of transcending the limitations that others tried to impose upon them. The sun still sets over the Caribbean waters, where Vane once sailed in pursuit of his impossible dream of absolute freedom. The islands remain as beautiful as ever, their beaches as white, and their waters as blue. But they shelter now only the descendants of those who learned to live within the boundaries that civilization had imposed upon human ambition. Yet on certain nights, when the wind is right and the sea calm, sailors still report seeing phantom ships on the horizon, vessels that appear and disappear like memories half remembered upon waking. Perhaps these are merely tricks of light and weather, optical illusions that science can easily explain. Or perhaps they are something more, reminders that the human spirit, once fully awakened to its own possibilities, cannot be entirely extinguished by defeat or death. Charles Vane had wagered everything on the belief that such awakening was possible, that men could live as free beings rather than as subjects of external authority. He lost that wager in the conventional sense, dying alone and defeated while his enemies went on to build the ordered world that followed. But in a deeper sense, his victory was guaranteed from the moment he made his choice, because some truths about human dignity and possibility cannot be defeated by mere practical failure. The legend of Charles Vane reminds us that there was once a time when the ocean itself seemed to offer refuge for those who refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose upon them. That time has passed, perhaps forever, but its memory survives in the stories we tell and the dreams we dare to dream about what life might be like if we possessed the courage to claim our birthright as free beings in an unlimited universe. Sleep now, and dream of distant waters where the only law was courage, and the only authority was that which free men granted to leaders they had chosen for themselves. Dream of ships that flew no flag but their own, of crews bound together by loyalty rather than fear, of men who discovered in exile from civilization the very freedom that civilization had promised but could never deliver. The story ends, but the sea continues, and somewhere in its depths the spirit of absolute resistance sails on, eternal and undefeated, waiting for the next soul brave enough to reject the comfortable prison of conventional life and set sail for the horizon where all possibilities remain open and all dreams might yet come true.